Chapter 20. A Safe Haven. Chris awoke with a start. His vision was very blurry, and it took a few minutes for his eyes to begin to focus on his surroundings. He knew he was lying down, but he couldn't seem to move his arms or legs. It felt like he was bound to something. Fear gripped him. For an awful moment he thought that they must have been recaptured. He could remember making their escape, but everything was hazy up until he was put onto a stretcher. Then everything was a blank. He must have passed out. Had all their efforts been for nothing? Was he about to be subjected to more torture? His body still ached all over. He started to panic and struggled to free himself from whatever was preventing him from moving his limbs, before he heard a familiar voice. "It's okay, you're safe. Just lie still. You need to rest." It was Devon. She was sitting in a chair next to him. She beamed at him before continuing. "We made it to the settlement. You gave us all quite a scare after you passed out. It was touch and go for a while as to whether you were going to make it or not." "How long have I been out for?" he managed to ask in a feeble voice. "About 3 days. You developed a fever soon after we arrived. If Lomai hadn't found the physician, I'm not sure you would have survived." "What about Norwood and the book?" "They've gone. James, Gaz and Lomai went back after we had you settled to ensure that they hadn't discovered our trail. Norwood searched quite a large area, but couldn't find us, and in the end he gave up. He had the book, after all, so I suppose he decided not to waste too much time on us. Anyway, rest now. I'll come back later," Devon said as she ran her fingers gently through his hair. Chris had already started to feel quite tired, even though he'd been completely out of it for the last 3 days. The calming sensation of her fingertips brushing through his hair had relaxed him to the point where he felt totally safe, and he soon drifted off to sleep again, his mind drifting off into dreams of peaceful forests with flowing rivers. The scent of the forest was the same as the sweet smell of Devon's perfume. Clearly his subconscious had already fallen deeply in love with her, not that he would remember any of that when he next awoke. Devon left the stone hut where Chris was recovering and stepped out into what could only be described as a muddy track. It was the main street of the small settlement. A number of those small huts, similar to the one she had just come from, were peppered along either side of the muddy track. If one were quick enough, you would have caught quick glimpses of some of the village children peering out from behind the corners of some of the huts. They had been very interested in the arrival of these strangers to their village. At first the children had hidden and peered out from their hiding places because they were rather shy and nervous of these strange newcomers to their village. Now that Devon and the others had been in the village for a few days and had been welcomed by the village elders, the children had become much bolder. They no longer hid out of fear. It was part of their new favourite game, attempting to dart from their hiding places and tag whichever one of the group was walking past. The ultimate aim was then to run away, normally laughing in delight at their small victory. Devon and the others were now well accustomed to this, and had entered into the spirit of the game, sometimes trying to catch the children as they reeled away to make their escape back to their safe hiding places behind the huts. Ollie had been rather taken aback the first time he had caught one of the children. The child burst into floods of tears and screamed for a long time until he let him go. At the time Ollie had been very apologetic, until he had realised that the child had only been faking, running off in hysterical laughter as soon as Ollie had released him. Since then every child in the village had become involved in this game. James and Gaz had found this Game rather amusing, especially when all of the children had ganged up on Ollie, clinging on to him until he fell over in the mud. The game certainly lightened their mood and acted as a welcome distraction from the events of the previous few days and the question of what to do next. Today was going to be no exception. As Devon walked down the muddy track towards the hut of the village chief, she pretended not to notice a small group of children trying to hide next to one of the huts, knowing full well what was about to happen. She let them get quite close to her before spinning round on her heels, sending the children scampering off in all directions in fits of laughter. She smiled with amusement and continued on her way to the chief's hut. She had spent a few hours each day talking to him. He was very knowledgeable about the area's history, and she'd learnt a lot from him about the legends and myths surrounding the disappearance of the Maya. The chief was a short and quite thin. His sun-baked skin revealed every one of his many wrinkles, particularly when he smiled. He was probably in his early 60s, although it was hard to tell. Jungle life was hard, and it had certainly taken its toll on the man. He wore the same traditional Guatemalan clothing that all the men of the village were dressed in, so unless you already knew he was the chief, you would not realise that he was. Like many small settlements, it was customary for the eldest man to fulfil this role, mainly because the oldest tended to be the most knowledgeable about the seasons, and clearly had been wise enough to endure those harsh jungle conditions. His long hair was grey, almost to the point of turning white. Despite his age, his eyes had not dulled at all. They were very dark brown and glistened like two stones of obsidian set deeply into his chocolate-coloured face. The chief excitedly greeted Devon at the entrance to his hut, just as he had done on the previous occasions that she had visited him, and ushered her inside his dimly lit hut. Her senses were met by a hedonistic smell of brewing coffee and melted chocolate as she entered. He was making one of the drinks that the Mayans had been famous for, the mocha. This wasn't anything like the mochas you would find on your local high street. This was the real thing. Rich, dark, silky smooth molten chocolate that had been made from cocoa beans, roasted and ground earlier that day, and was now being gently heated over an open fire, and next to it a pot of water was gradually coming to the boil. The coffee beans were almost as dark as the chocolate, and had been carefully selected from the katura plants that grew high above the village on the mountain slopes. Once the chocolate had fully melted and the coffee had boiled, the chief took them off the fire, and taking 2 clay mugs from a shelf, he placed them on the tiled floor next to the fire. He carefully poured a decent amount of the rich, dark chocolate into each clay vessel before he added the coffee. Finally, he stirred the contents to ensure that the coffee fully mixed with the hot chocolate. Devon graciously took one of the mugs from him. This was the second reason for her visit. She'd been hooked ever since the first time she had sipped his hot concoction, and every time since. Her love of the intoxicating liquid grew. The light, fruity notes of the coffee were perfectly offset by the sharp bitterness of the hot chocolate. They both sat on their cushions in the hut for a few moments, not speaking, just savouring the flavours and rich aromas of the bitter-sweet, muddy fluid. A broad smile spread across the old man's face, and he let out a long sigh as the hot, thick liquid flowed down his throat. Devon was in chocolate heaven, as the liquid slipped down like an endless silk stream. She would never be able to enjoy a high street mocha in quite the same way again, without being reminded of her time spent in the chief's cosy little hut, surrounded by those seductive smells. The Mayans had truly been master chocolatiers. She spent the next 2 hours chatting with the Guatemalan elder about how the seasons were changing, how the rains were becoming heavier and less predictable, and the effect this was having on both the cocoa and coffee harvests. He reminisced on how the cocoa plants used to grow all the way down the hillside, right up to the back of the huts, but now they had to trek a fair distance into the jungle to reach the same plants. Many of the other nearby settlements had either shrunk or been totally deserted as farmers had relocated away from the worsening jungle conditions, lured by the prospects of jobs and an easier life nearer to the ever-expanding metropolises. Not that living conditions were much better close to the cities. As fast as the cities were developing, they could not build houses fast enough for the hordes of people emerging from the jungle. Large shanty towns had sprung up on the outskirts of these modern wonders, and with these, the familiar squalor of poor hygiene and cramped conditions followed. The chief admitted that he had been tempted once or twice to relocate the village closer to one of these fair cities, but once word had reached him about the conditions, he had decided that the village would be better off staying put. At least they had clean running water and plenty of space to expand if needed. Devon agreed with his point of view. She had seen the phenomenon of these mass exoduses and its effect in both Mexico City and Rio de Janeiro. The strange combination of mega-rich, living just a stone's throw away from absolute depravity, soaring crime rates, and dangerous streets. Even with all the dangers of the jungle, she could not see life being any more dangerous than the new metropolis that was Guatemala City. James, Gaz, Ollie and Lomai had left earlier that morning to explore the area to the east of the settlement in order to plan their route away from the village and hopefully to cross the border into Belize. This would be the way they would travel once Chris was well enough to make the journey. James hoped that once in Belize they would be able to secure passage on a boat back to the UK. So far they had made good progress through the thick jungle along one of the many tracks that crisscrossed the dense vegetation, cutting a winding route along the part of the Patan Basin. It was in regular use by the villagers, so the jungle had not really made a great impact on it. There were a few areas where the jungle had encroached onto it, and they had to hack their way through with machetes, but on the whole it was clear. The time was approaching midday when they finally emerged from the jungle onto the main road, CA 78. It was still by Western standards not much more than a gravel track, but this was frequently travelled by cars and buses, and was a well-established road in that sense, compared with the muddy street they had set out from that morning. After discussing with Lomai, they decided to stop by the side of the road and have a bite to eat. Although buses did not run particularly regularly along these roads, James hoped that one may pass by whilst they were there. He would then be able to find out from the driver exactly how frequently the service ran to the border. He still had no idea exactly how long it would be before Chris would be fit to travel, but at least if he knew when the buses passed by that area, he could plan to catch one rather than the group trekking through the jungle, only to have to camp for several days by the side of the road, waiting for a bus to magically appear. This was not a prospect that filled him with joy. Trading the safety of the settlement for the dangers of the jungle would not be advisable for a group with very limited resources. In the end, they waited by the roadside for several hours, and were about to call it a day and return to the village, before the light started to fade. when they saw some dust being kicked up further along the road. However, it was not a bus, or in fact any vehicle that emerged from around the bend to the west of them, but a herd of goats being driven by two young boys. Clearly they were moving the animals either to a settlement further down the valley or to fresh pastures. Either way, they obviously travelled the road on a regular basis, and would no doubt know how frequently the buses ran and what their destinations were. The boys apprehensively approached the group. This area was notorious for bandits. Their apprehension was put at ease as Lomai greeted them in their native tongue and explained the group's situation. "Good news, Senor James. They say that there is a bus that runs along here twice a week. It will take you into Belize. They are not sure exactly what days, so you may have to camp for a day or two, but no longer than that. I'm sure we can arrange for a few men from the village to accompany you here when Senor Chris is better." "That's great news, Lomai," James replied. The two boys continued along the road, and as the bells from the herd of goats faded into the distance, the group began to make their way back along the jungle track to the village. Even at a brisk pace, they would not arrive back at the village until after the sun had dipped below the mountain's crest. James could just make out the lights from the village fires flickering through the trees as they finally approached the village. It had been a good day. He had enjoyed trekking through the jungle and was learning a lot from Lomai about how to navigate through the dense forests, picking up and distinguishing the trails of the various fauna that had passed through the undergrowth. Lomai had been in his element. It was obvious that he was happiest when he was tracking animals. In all, the trip had been a successful one, and hopefully they would soon be able to leave the village for good and begin their return journey back to the UK. Nevertheless, it had been a long day, and James was starting to look forward to a hot meal and to find out how Chris's recovery was going. Ollie and Gaz were also glad to be back at the village. They had been getting a bit bored of the endless jungle and the humidity that accompanied it. Both of them had been planning their next prank to play on the children of the village. Their last encounter with the children had ended in both Gaz and Ollie being covered head to toe in mud. They had vowed to get their own back on the little scamps before they left the village. The four of them headed straight for the two huts they were staying in. They hoped to find a hot meal waiting for them. Rachel and Devon had hopefully already made something in anticipation of their return. To their surprise, they found that this was not the case as they entered the huts. The fires were burning inside, but the girls had not been cooking, and were nowhere to be seen. The boys dumped their sacks down and gathered back outside the huts. "Well, that's not exactly what I was expecting," James said. "Where do you think they've got to?" Just as he was about to go and look for the girls, he spied Rachel coming out of the chief's hut. She smiled at the sight of the group and walked over to speak to them. She hugged James. "Nice to see you are safely back. Have you had any luck on your travels?" she asked. "Sort of. Seems we may have found a way into Belize. Well, at least as far as the border. Still have to work out how to cross without a passport, but we'll bridge that gap when we come to it." "What happened to the cooking plans?" James asked. Well, the chief's invited us all to eat with him this evening. So, when you're ready..." "Perfect, I'm starving," Gaz announced. "There's a surprise," she replied with a broad grin, knowing full well that Gaz had a voracious appetite. The chief warmly greeted them as they entered his hut. He gestured for them to sit and make themselves comfortable inside. There was a large fire that had been built in the centre of the hut, and the heat radiating from the embers kept the hut and its occupants warm. Above the embers hung a large cooking pot, full of a stew made from a recently slaughtered goat, mixed with some local herbs and spices. This was to be accompanied by some flatbread that had been baked earlier that day. The group formed a circle around the fire, chatting away about the route down to the main road, and discussing with the chief about the possibility of being accompanied by some of the men from the village when they finally made their departure. The chief thought about this request for a while before giving his answer. It depends on exactly when, because it is the harvest season for the coffee beans. We are very busy. However, I'm sure we may be able to spare a couple of men to accompany on your journey as far as the main road. But I think it will be at least another week before your injured friend has recovered enough to be able to make the journey. We can talk about it closer to the time. Now please, relax and eat. Gaz and Ollie didn't need to be told twice, and immediately started to heap the hot stew into some clay bowls that had been provided for the meal. "This is great," Gaz mumbled in between mouthfuls. "I haven't had a lot of goat stew, but this is probably the best I've ever tasted." "I'm surprised you can even taste it at the rate you're shoveling it in," Ollie retorted, laughing at the sight of Gaz trying to lick the thick gravy-like sauce from his chin, with little success. After the meal, Devon excused herself and took a bowl of stew to Chris, who was probably up by now. She had taken it upon herself to make sure that he was well fed, since he'd been laid up in bed. He was glad to see her, and was certainly in higher spirits than he had been on previous occasions that she had seen him. He hated being bedbound, and was eager to start moving around, although it was evident that he would have to remain in bed for at least a few more days, until his strength had fully recovered. James popped in a little later, and kept him up to date with the plans of what was going on, what their plans were, and what had become of Norwood's party. After an hour it was clear that Chris was starting to become tired, so they left him to rest and returned to the chief's hut. They found Gaz and Ollie in full flow with the chief, talking about their next prank for the children. The chief was amused by their plans. He too had found these new games between the two young men and the children highly entertaining. The chief thought that it was good that the children were keenly taking an interest in the newcomers. They didn't get many opportunities to interact with the outside world, and therefore it was good that they had formed a bond with their guests. They would certainly be sad to see them leave, but at least they would have some fond memories of the time they had spent together.